Have you ever noticed how, you know, we humans just can't help but try to figure things out?
Oh, absolutely. Like, where do we fit in? What's it all about? That kind of thing.
Exactly. It's like we're all kind of acting like philosophers, even if we don't realize it.
Yeah, we're always looking for answers, for meaning, for understanding.
And speaking of understanding, that's what we're doing today, diving deep into some fascinating ideas. This time, it's all about Hans Vaihinger and his concept of fictionalism.
It's a pretty wild way of looking at knowledge and reality. Really makes you think.
And the source for this deep dive, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Vaihinger, it's just jam-packed with thought-provoking stuff.
Vaihinger was really influenced by some heavy hitters, too. Thinkers like Kant, Schopenhauer, even Darwin. And he kind of took their ideas and came up with a radical idea. What if many of the concepts we think are, like, absolutely true are actually fictions?
Fictions, that's a pretty big claim, right?
Yeah, but useful fictions, that's the key.
So, like, the tools we use in science, math, even just everyday life, they could be based on things that aren't literally true.
It sounds crazy, but that's what we're going to explore today. See how Vainger's ideas could totally change how we see the world.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But first, who was this Hans Vaihinger guy? What's his story?
Well, he lived from 1852 to 1933, and he was a big deal in Neo-Kantian philosophy. But he wasn't just stuck in one area. He had a real impact on how we think about knowledge itself, epistemology, as well as the philosophy of science and math. He even delved into the history of philosophy.
Wow, a real intellectual all-rounder.
Absolutely.
Hmm?
But when it comes to his big contribution, you got to talk about his most famous work, Die Philosophie des Als-ob.
Okay, what does that mean?
That translates to the philosophy of as if, and that's where he really lays out this whole fictionalism thing. It's a deep dive for sure.
The philosophy of as if. Just the title alone makes you think, huh?
Right. It gets you curious.
So how did he even come up with these ideas? What was his journey like?
Well, it's a bit of a winding path, actually. You see, he started off studying theology, following in his dad's footsteps.
Theology. That's quite a shift to philosophy.
Yeah, but his curiosity just took over. He got drawn into philosophy and natural science.
I can relate to that.
Right. And for about 4 years, he went deep, like really deep, into the works of those German idealism giants. Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, all while exploring, on his own, the very different ideas of Schopenhauer and Darwin.
Wow, that's a lot to juggle.
Yeah, and even his doctoral dissertation, which was about theories of consciousness, kind of hinted at this deep engagement he had with all these different thinkers.
It sounds like all these different ideas were swirling around in his head.
Definitely. But there was one encounter that really pushed him towards fictionalism.
Oh, what was that?
Well, after a short break, thankfully because of his eyesight, he got a chance to attend lectures at the University of Leipzig. And that's where he stumbled upon the work of Friedrich Lange.
Another philosopher?
Yeah, another Neo-Kantian. And honestly, after Kant himself, Lange was probably the biggest influence on Vaihinger.
Ah, so what was it about Lange that resonated so much with him?
It was Lange's book, History of Materialism. Vaihinger called it a revelation, like he'd finally found the intellectual guidance he was searching for. From that point on, he saw himself as Lange's, intellectual heir.
Wow, that's quite a connection. What exactly was it about Lange's work that had such a huge impact and kind of pointed him in the direction of fictionalism?
Well, Lange believed in the power of empirical science, using real-world observations to inform our philosophical thinking. But at the same time, he was very aware of the limitations of human knowledge, especially when it comes to figuring out ultimate reality, those things in themselves that Kant talked about.
So he saw the value of science, but also recognized the boundaries of what we can actually know.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing. He managed to bring together these two seemingly opposite ideas, empirical observation and a kind of idealism, acknowledging the mind's active role in shaping how we see things. And that became a crucial foundation for Vaihinger's own philosophy, the idea of using useful fictions to understand the world.
Okay, so we've talked about the influences and the key players. Now let's get to the heart of it. What exactly is this fictionalism or idealistic positivism? When Vaihinger talks about as if, what's he really getting at?
So imagine this. We use all these concepts, theories, even beliefs in our daily lives, right? But Vaihinger's saying we don't actually know for sure if they're literally true, like a perfect reflection of reality. Instead, we use them because they're super useful for navigating the world, for making sense of things, and for getting what we want. We act as if they're true.
So it's not so much about finding the absolute ultimate truth, but more about using ideas that work, that have practical value.
Exactly. We're not necessarily aiming for a perfect copy of reality in our minds. We're trying to survive, to understand patterns, and to figure out what's going to happen next. And these fictions, that's what Vaihinger calls them, they're tools to help us do that.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. It challenges our assumptions about knowledge, that's for sure.
You mentioned earlier that Vaihinger drew on the ideas of Lange, Schopenhauer, and Darwin. Let's dig a little deeper into how they contributed to his fictionalism. First up, Friedrich Lange. How did his specific flavor of Neo-Kantianism play into this whole fictions idea?
Right, so Lange was crucial. He argued that even the most solid findings of science, the stuff that seems super objective, actually points towards a kind of transcendental idealism.
Hold on, transcendental idealism. That sounds pretty complex.
It is, but the basic idea is that our minds don't just passively record reality.
Yeah.
They actually structure and shape the way we experience the world.
So our minds aren't just mirrors reflecting the world, they're actively creating our experience.
Exactly. And Lange used examples from physiology, like how our senses don't just take in information, but also filter and interpret it. Vaihinger took this even further and thought, well, if even our basic perceptions are already interpretations, then maybe many of our more complex ideas are also mental constructs, not just literal truths about some independent reality.
So we're already acting as if our senses are giving us a completely objective view, when in reality our minds are shaping things all the time.
Exactly. It's like our perception is already layered with as if.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. What about Schopenhauer? How did his philosophy fit in with Vaihinger's fictionalism?
Schopenhauer had this powerful idea about the intellect being a tool in service of the will. This will is like a blind driving force that's behind everything, always striving. He believed our intelligence evolved as a way to help us get what we want, to survive in a challenging world.
So our intelligence isn't really about finding some ultimate truth, but about helping us get by, fulfilling our desires.
Exactly. And Vaihinger loved this idea. He thought it meant that our thinking is geared more toward action than pure objective contemplation.
Interesting. And then Darwin comes in with his theory of natural selection, providing like scientific backing for Schopenhauer's idea, right?
Exactly. Vaihinger saw Darwin's work as the perfect explanation for why our knowledge has limits. It's not some random thing. It's because our thought process is developed to help us survive and, pass on our genes. It's a certain way of thinking, even if it wasn't perfectly accurate, helped our ancestors survive and reproduce, then that way of thinking would stick around.
So it's like our brains aren't optimized for finding ultimate truths, but for solving the problems of everyday life, making sure we survive and thrive.
Yeah, that's a big shift in how we usually think about knowledge.
It really is. So if these fictions aren't literally true, how do they actually help us navigate the world? I know Vaihinger made a distinction between semi-fictions and real fictions, right? What's the difference between those two?
Okay, so semi-fictions are basically simplifications. Like, we know reality is super complex, but we create these simplified versions to help us wrap our heads around things. Think about physics, for example.
Yeah.
When you're calculating, say, the gravity between the sun and Earth, you often treat them like they're single points. Right?
Yeah, even though we know they're huge and complex.
Exactly. But that simplification, even though it's not literally true, makes the math way easier and helps us understand how the solar system works. It's a trade-off, sacrificing a bit of accuracy for more manageable understanding.
Okay, so semi-fictions are like useful shortcuts. What about real fictions? Those sound even more, I don't know, paradoxical.
Now, real fictions are where things get really interesting. These are concepts that aren't just simplified. They're actually self-contradictory, like their definition just doesn't make sense logically. But Vaihinger argued that they can still be incredibly useful for thinking.
Wait, how can something that's self-contradictory be useful for thinking? Isn't that like breaking the rules of logic?
Well, here's the thing. Vaihinger thought these seemingly nonsensical ideas could still lead to genuine insights by allowing us to explore connections and come up with useful conclusions. His favorite example was Archimedes' proof for the area of a circle.
I vaguely remember that from geometry class.
So, Archimedes figured out the area of a circle by imagining it as if it were a polygon with more and more sides.
But a circle isn't a polygon, right?
Exactly, that's the point. The initial idea, treating the circle as if it were a polygon, is totally false, even contradictory. But by going through the steps of reasoning as if it were true, he could come up with the actual formula for a circle's area. It's like using a temporary scaffold to build something. You needed to reach certain points and do the work, but the scaffold itself isn't part of the final structure.
So it's not about whether the starting point is actually true, but more about the logical steps you take after that, even if the premise is impossible?
Yeah, that's it. What matters is the connection between the ideas, not whether they perfectly match reality. This gets into the whole idea of counterpossible reasoning, where you explore what would follow logically, even if you start with something impossible.
Okay, that is pretty wild. So we're playing with logic here, stretching it to see what we can discover. But how did Vaihinger differentiate his ideas from, say, pragmatism, which is all about the usefulness of ideas? They seem kind of similar, right?
Right, they do seem similar on the surface, but Vaihinger actually pushed back against the idea that just because an idea is useful, it means it's true in a literal sense. He acknowledged that practical value is important, but it doesn't automatically make something a true representation of reality. For him, fictionalism is about using the utility of an idea as a reason to use it, to act as if it were true, but not necessarily to believe it's the ultimate truth.
So a tool, whether it's a scientific model or a math concept, can be super useful and effective without being a perfect picture of reality.
Precisely. Think about a map, for example. It's super helpful for navigating, for getting where you need to go. But it's not an exact replica of the actual terrain, right? It simplifies things, leaves things out. In a way, it's a fiction, a representation that helps us achieve something practical, but it's not a perfect copy of reality.
That's a great analogy. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Vaihinger's take on Immanuel Kant. He had some pretty interesting interpretations of Kant's work, right? Didn't he come up with that patchwork thesis?
Yeah, the patchwork thesis was a pretty bold claim. It basically argued that Kant's famous book, The Critique of Pure Reason, wasn't this perfectly unified, completely consistent philosophical system that everyone thought it was.
Wait, so he's saying Kant's masterpiece wasn't as perfect as people thought?
Yeah, kind of. Vaihinger thought more like a compilation, a patchwork of different ideas and arguments that came from various stages of Kant's intellectual development.
Like different layers of thinking, almost like geological layers.
Exactly. He thought that by looking closely at how Kant's thinking evolved, from his early engagement with rationalism to his later focus on empiricism and then to his critical philosophy, you could spot these distinct and sometimes contradictory ideas. And Vaihinger argued that traces of those earlier phases of thought were still present in the critique, which led to inconsistencies and tensions in the final work.
So he's saying Kant's work is more like a historical artifact, with different layers of thought that don't always perfectly fit together. Interesting. How did this particular interpretation of Kant influence his fictionalism?
Well, one key way was through how he looked at Kant's ideas of pure reason. These are concepts like the immaterial soul, human freedom, and God. Kant said we can't really know these things empirically, but they're still important as regulative principles for our thinking and morality. But Vaihinger went further and said these ideas weren't just regulative principles, they were actually self-conscious fictions.
So these big metaphysical concepts weren't necessarily beliefs about ultimate reality, but more like tools to help us understand and act in the world.
Exactly. They're valuable because of how they structure our thinking and guide our actions, not because we have proof they're literally true. And Vaihinger even pointed out that Kant himself sometimes used the phrase as if when talking about these ideas, which he saw as supporting his fictionalist view.
So even Kant, in a way, hinted at this idea of using concepts as if they were true, even if we can't definitively prove them.
Yeah, Vaihinger thought so.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, this interpretation of Kant's ideas seems to tie in with his idea of idealistic positivism. Can we unpack that a bit? It's another one of those philosophical terms that can be a bit dense.
Right, it does sound a bit intimidating. But the basic idea is that Vaihinger disagreed with Kant on one big thing, the thing in itself. Kant thought there was this unknowable reality that exists independently of our experience. But Vaihinger said, nope, the thing in itself is actually a useless fiction.
So he's saying there's no point in speculating about this ultimate reality that we can't actually access.
Yeah, for him, reality was basically just the raw data of our sensations, what we experience directly. And even concepts like substance and causality, which Kant thought were like fundamental categories of understanding, Vaihinger saw as useful fictions.
So we're basically taking the stream of sensations and using these mental constructs, these fictions, to organize and make sense of it all.
Exactly. It's not that there's no external world, but the way we understand it is always shaped by these mental tools, these useful fictions.
This is really making me rethink how I view knowledge and reality. It's pretty profound stuff.
It is. It really challenges our basic assumptions.
One last thing I want to touch on is the distinction Vaihinger made between fictions and hypotheses. How did he see those two working together, and what's this law of ideational shifts all about?
All right, so for Vaihinger, a hypothesis is basically a statement that we think might be true. We can test it through observation and experiments. A fiction, on the other hand, is something we consciously accept as not literally true, but still useful for thinking or acting.
So a hypothesis is something we're trying to prove or disprove, and a fiction is something we use even though we know it's not literally true.
Exactly. And the law of ideational shifts basically says that over time, fictions can get mistaken for hypotheses and vice versa.
So things can get blurred.
Yeah, like what starts as a useful tool can start to be seen as a literal truth, and something that was once considered a possible explanation can become a kind of unquestioned assumption.
Can you give an example of how that might happen?
Sure, think about the concept of atoms. Initially, the idea of atoms was probably introduced as a kind of useful fiction, a way to explain things in chemistry and physics. But over time, it became treated as a literal hypothesis about the structure of reality, leading to all sorts of debates about whether atoms actually exist and what their properties are.
So people started arguing about whether this model was actually true instead of just seeing it as a helpful tool.
Exactly. Vaihinger thought that recognizing atomism, at least in its early stages, as a useful fiction rather than a truth claim could have helped avoid those debates. The model's useful for explaining things, regardless of whether atoms are real in some ultimate sense.
So by being aware that something might be a useful fiction, we can avoid getting stuck in arguments about whether it's absolutely true and focus on its practical value. That's a really helpful insight.
Yeah, it allows for more flexibility and pragmatism in how we approach knowledge.
This deep dive into Hans Vaihinger's fictionalism has been truly mind-expanding. So to recap, the big takeaway is that an idea doesn't have to be literally true to be incredibly useful.
Absolutely. Vaihinger's philosophy of as if encourages us to think critically about the role these useful fictions play in our lives. They shape how we understand ourselves, the world around us, and ultimately how we make decisions.
It's about recognizing the power and the limits of the tools we use to think.
Yeah.
And this brings up a really interesting question. What are some of the concepts that we might be treating as absolute truths in our own lives?
Right. This stuff we just take for granted.
Maybe they're actually useful fictions that we could benefit from examining more closely. That's something for everyone listening to think about.
It's a great exercise in intellectual humility, for sure.
It is. Now, it's fascinating that Vaihinger's work, while initially popular, kind of faded into obscurity for a while. But now, there seems to be a resurgence of interest in his ideas.
Yeah, it seems his time has come again.
Maybe his insights are particularly relevant now in our complex, information-saturated world.
I think so. His work is becoming increasingly relevant in fields like philosophy of science, epistemology, even cognitive science. He offers a way to navigate the uncertainties of the modern world.
So the big question is, could embracing the power of these useful fictions, recognizing their value without clinging to them as absolute truths, be the key to navigating our complex and uncertain world? What do you think?
It's a powerful idea, that's for sure. It's something worth pondering as we move forward.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive into Vaihinger with me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me. Always a great time exploring these big ideas.
And for everyone listening, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep acting like the philosophers you truly are.